Sarah Martinez stared at her Netflix screen at 2:47 a.m., her heart pounding as she saw it. Continue watching Bridgerton, episode 6. But she had never watched Bridgerton. Neither had her husband Mark, or so she thought. The viewing history showed someone had been binge-watching romantic series every Tuesday and Thursday evening, while she worked late shifts at the hospital. What happened next would expose a web of lies that had been carefully constructed for 8 months. And the way Sarah chose to handle it would not only save her marriage, but transform her into the woman she never knew she could become. My name is Sarah Martinez, and I'm a 34-year-old emergency room nurse from Phoenix, Arizona. For 12 years, I'd built what I thought was the perfect marriage with Mark, a 36-year-old software engineer with kind brown eyes and a laugh that could fill any room. We lived in a cozy 2-story house in Ahwatukee, complete with a white picket fence that Mark had insisted on painting himself 3 summers ago. We had talked about children, planned European vacations we never took, and shared everything from bank accounts to Netflix passwords. Or at least, I thought we shared everything. But if you're watching this story, you probably know that sometimes the life we think we're living is just a beautiful illusion, carefully maintained by the people we trust most. And sometimes it takes something as simple as a Netflix viewing history to shatter that illusion completely. What I discovered that night in March 2024 would test everything I believed about love, trust, and my own strength. But more importantly, it would teach me that sometimes the most devastating betrayal can become the catalyst for the most incredible transformation. The stakes couldn't have been higher. 12 years of marriage, a shared mortgage, combined finances, and most importantly, the deep love I still felt for the man sleeping peacefully beside me while I sat in our living room, staring at evidence of his deception. But what I didn't know then was that this moment of discovery was just the beginning of a journey that would take me from being a woman who doubted her own worth to someone who would emerge stronger, more confident, and more empowered than I had ever imagined possible. Before we dive deeper into this story, if you've ever felt like your world was turned upside down by betrayal, or if you're struggling to find your strength in a difficult relationship, I want you to know you're not alone. Please consider subscribing to this channel and hitting that notification bell, because stories like these remind us that we're all more resilient than we think. And don't forget to leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Life before that March night seemed almost mundane in its predictability. But looking back, I now understand that predictability was the foundation upon which my entire sense of security rested. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., my alarm would buzz on the nightstand, and I'd roll over to find Mark already gone for his early morning run through the Desert Vista trail system. He'd return by 6:15, showered and ready for coffee, his dark hair still damp and his olive skin glowing from the Arizona sun. Morning. Beautiful, he'd say every single day, planting a kiss on my forehead as I stumbled toward the coffee maker in my scrubs. It was a ritual that had remained unchanged for over a decade, a small gesture that made me feel cherished and secure in our routine. My shifts at Phoenix General were demanding but fulfilling. As a senior emergency room nurse, I'd seen it all. Heart attacks, car accidents, overdoses, and miraculous recoveries that reminded me why I'd chosen this profession. The work was intense, often requiring 12-hour shifts that left me physically and emotionally drained. But Mark seemed to understand. He'd have dinner waiting when I came home from evening shifts, usually something simple but thoughtful, grilled chicken with the seasoning I loved, or pasta with the marinara sauce he'd learned to make from his Italian grandmother. Our evenings together followed a comfortable pattern. We'd eat dinner while sharing stories from our days. Mark would tell me about the software debugging challenges he'd faced at his tech company, while I'd share the more lighthearted moments from the ER, like the elderly man who'd come in convinced he was having a heart attack, only to discover he'd simply eaten too much of his wife's famous chili. Weekends were our sanctuary. Saturday mornings meant sleeping in until 8 a.m., luxurious by our standards, followed by trips to the Phoenix Farmers Market where we'd buy fresh produce and homemade salsa from a local vendor who always remembered our names. Mark had a particular fondness for the kettle corn stand, and I loved watching his face light up like a child's as he got his weekly fix of the sweet and salty treat. Sunday afternoons were reserved for what we called couch time, binge-watching series together, while I caught up on medical journals, and Mark worked on his personal coding projects. We'd discovered a shared love for crime documentaries and British comedies, often debating the plausibility of the cases or laughing until our sides hurt at the dry humor. But even in this seemingly perfect routine, there were small cracks that I had learned to ignore or rationalize away. Mark had started working later than usual, claiming his company was under pressure to deliver a major software update. Just temporary, he'd assure me, maybe 2 more months of these crazy hours. Those 2 months had stretched into 8, but I trusted him completely. Healthcare workers understand demanding schedules, and I respected his dedication to his career. There were also the Tuesday and Thursday evenings when he'd suggest I grab dinner with my colleague Jennifer after my shifts. "You work so hard," he'd say. "You deserve some friend time." I appreciated his thoughtfulness, even though I sometimes just wanted to come home and collapse next to him on our oversized sectional sofa. Our physical intimacy had shifted too, but gradually enough that I attributed it to the natural evolution of a long marriage combined with our stressful jobs. Where we once made love several times a week, it had become a weekly occurrence, then bi-weekly. Mark would explain that work stress was affecting his libido, and I'd nod understandingly while pushing down my own feelings of rejection. I told myself that emotional intimacy was more important anyway, and we still held hands during movies and cuddled every night before sleep. The house itself reflected our shared dreams and careful planning. We'd bought it 7 years ago, a 2,400 square foot home with 4 bedrooms, one for us, one for Mark's home office, one that served as my craft room where I pursued my hobby of jewelry making, and one that we optimistically called the future nursery. The walls were painted in warm earth tones that complemented Arizona's desert landscape, and every room contained small touches that told the story of our relationship. Framed photos from our honeymoon in Maui, the handmade ceramic bowls we'd created together at a pottery class, Mark's collection of vintage science fiction novels sharing shelf space with my medical textbooks. Financially, we were stable and responsible. We'd always maintained joint accounts, a decision we'd made early in our marriage as a symbol of our commitment to transparency and partnership. Mark handled most of our online banking and bill paying, an arrangement that worked well since his job gave him more predictable hours than mine. Every month, he'd show me our financial summary, and we'd discuss any major purchases or investment decisions together. I trusted his financial management completely. He was methodical and careful with money, traits that had allowed us to save enough for a down payment on the house and maintain a healthy emergency fund. Our social life revolved around a small but close circle of friends, mostly other couples we'd met through work or our neighborhood. We'd host barbecues in our backyard, attend birthday parties, and participate in an annual camping trip to Sedona with 3 other couples. Mark was always the one who organized these gatherings, sending out group texts and coordinating logistics. His friends would often comment on how lucky I was to have such an attentive husband, and I'd smile and agree, feeling genuinely grateful for the man I'd married. Even our families approved of our relationship. Mark's parents, who lived in Tucson, would visit every few months, and his mother would always pull me aside to tell me how happy Mark seemed since we'd married. My own parents, who had divorced when I was 16, would often comment that Mark and I had the kind of marriage they wished they could have achieved. "You two just fit together," my mother would say, and I believed her completely. But relationships, like the human body, can hide serious problems beneath a surface that appears perfectly healthy. Just as I'd learned in nursing that the most dangerous conditions often present with subtle symptoms, the most devastating betrayals can occur within relationships that seem unshakably strong. The challenge is that we often ignore the small signs because we can't imagine that the foundation we trust could be crumbling beneath us. Looking back now, I can see the subtle changes that I had unconsciously noted but consciously dismissed. Mark's phone, which used to sit casually on counters and tables, now seemed permanently attached to his person. He'd started taking calls in his office with the door closed, explaining that client confidentiality required more privacy. His laptop, which had once been shared freely between us for everything from online shopping to checking email, now required a password that he claimed his company had mandated for security reasons. There were also small shifts in his appearance and habits. He'd started working out more intensively, trading his casual morning jogs for serious gym sessions 3 times a week. When I complimented his improved physique, he'd shrug and say he was just trying to stay healthy as he approached his late 30s. He'd also upgraded his wardrobe, replacing his comfortable cotton shirts with more stylish button-downs and trading his worn sneakers for sleek leather shoes. "I'm representing the company more with clients now," he'd explain when I noticed. The most significant change, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time, was in how he spoke about the future. Where we once made concrete plans, discussing vacation destinations, home improvement projects, or even the possibility of starting a family, our conversations had become more vague and short-term focused. When I'd bring up the European vacation we'd been planning, he'd say we should wait until his work situation stabilized. When I'd mention converting the spare bedroom into a nursery, he'd suggest we table family planning discussions until we were both less stressed with work. But on March 15th, 2024, all of these small, rational explanations would prove to be carefully constructed lies designed to protect a secret that had been growing in the shadows of our seemingly perfect life. And it would all unravel because of something as simple as a Netflix account we'd shared for over 5 years. A shared digital space where Mark had apparently forgotten that every click, every viewing choice, every late-night binge session left a permanent trail. That Thursday evening started like any other. I'd finished a particularly challenging shift in the ER. We'd treated a teenage car accident victim who'd reminded me of my younger sister, and the emotional weight of helping his family through the crisis had left me drained. Mark had texted around 6 p.m. to suggest I grab dinner with Jennifer, his usual thoughtful gesture when he knew I'd had a difficult day. Jennifer and I went to our favorite Mexican restaurant, Rosita's, where we shared nachos and talked about everything from hospital politics to her ongoing struggles with online dating. She was my closest friend at work, a fellow nurse who understood the unique stresses of emergency medicine. We talked for about 2 hours, and by the time I got home at 9:30 p.m., Mark was in his office, door closed, with the soft glow of his computer screen visible under the crack. "How was dinner?" he called out when he heard me come in. "Good," I replied, hanging my keys on the hook by the door. "Jennifer's thinking about moving to Denver to be closer to her sister." "That's nice," came his distracted response. "I'm just finishing up some work stuff. Might be another hour or so." This had become our standard evening interaction when I worked late shifts. I'd heat up the leftovers he'd prepared, watch some television, and usually be asleep by the time he finished whatever project was keeping him busy. It was a routine that had evolved gradually, and I'd accepted it as a temporary sacrifice for his career advancement. But that night, something was different. Maybe it was the emotional residue from the day's difficult cases, or maybe it was simply the accumulation of months of subtle disconnection. But I found myself feeling unusually restless and lonely. Instead of going straight to bed as usual, I decided to stay up and watch something on Netflix, hoping it might help me decompress from the day's stress. I settled onto our sectional sofa with a cup of chamomile tea, grabbed the remote and opened our Netflix account. That's when I saw it. The Continue Watching section showed several series that I didn't recognize. Bridgerton, Emily in Paris, Virgin River, and Sweet Tooth. But it wasn't just that these were shows I'd never watched. They were shows that Mark had specifically mocked in the past. He'd always preferred science fiction, crime thrillers, and documentaries. Romance series were something he'd regularly dismissed as unrealistic fluff. My first instinct was confusion rather than suspicion. Maybe Netflix's algorithm had malfunctioned. Maybe there had been some kind of account mix-up. I clicked on the viewing activity, a feature I'd used before when trying to remember where we'd left off on a series we'd started months earlier. What I found there would change everything. The viewing history showed a pattern that made my blood run cold. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, from approximately 7 p.m. to 10 p.m., someone had been watching romantic series, comedies, and feel-good movies. These were the exact nights when Mark would encourage me to have dinner with friends after my shifts. These were the nights when he'd tell me he was working late and needed quiet to focus on important projects. But if Mark was watching these shows alone, why would he choose romantic comedies and relationship dramas? And why did the viewing patterns show that whoever was watching would pause episodes frequently, as if they were being interrupted by conversation or other activities? My hands were shaking as I scrolled through months of viewing history. The pattern was consistent and undeniable. While I'd been having dinner with Jennifer or staying late at the hospital for training sessions, someone had been using our living room, our Netflix account. Our shared space to watch shows that suggested they weren't watching alone. I sat there in the dark living room, the television's glow illuminating what I now understood was the wreckage of everything I'd believed about my marriage. The comfortable routine that had given me such security was actually a carefully choreographed deception. The thoughtful suggestions that I spend time with friends weren't born from his consideration of my needs. They were strategic, manipulations designed to give him freedom to betray everything we'd built together. The most devastating realization wasn't just that Mark was cheating on me, it was that he'd been using our home, our private sanctuary, our shared Netflix account to entertain his affair. Every Tuesday and Thursday, while I worked or spent time with friends believing I was giving him space to advance his career, he'd been building intimacy with someone else in the space that was supposed to be ours. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the screen, but eventually I heard Mark's office door open. His footsteps moved toward our bedroom, and I listened as he went through his usual nighttime routine, brushing his teeth, changing into pajamas, setting his phone on the nightstand. He probably assumed I was already asleep, as I usually was by this time, but I wasn't asleep. I was sitting in our living room, holding evidence of his betrayal in my hands, and trying to figure out what to do with the knowledge that was threatening to destroy everything I'd thought I knew about my life. The next few days passed in a surreal haze where I felt like I was living two lives simultaneously. During the day, I continued my routine as if nothing had changed, caring for patients in the ER, responding to Mark's text messages, maintaining the facade of our normal relationship. But underneath the surface, I was drowning in a mixture of rage, heartbreak, and desperate hope that I had somehow misinterpreted what I'd discovered. I found myself analyzing every interaction with Mark through this new lens of suspicion. When he kissed me goodbye Friday morning before his run, I wondered if he was thinking about her. When he asked about my day during dinner Friday night, I questioned whether his interest was genuine or just guilt-driven performance. Most torturous of all, when he suggested Saturday morning that we skip the farmer's market because he had some work to catch up on, I knew with sickening certainty that work had nothing to do with his plans, but I said nothing. I wasn't ready to confront him because I wasn't ready for the conversation that would inevitably destroy our marriage. Part of me still clung to the hope that there was some innocent explanation, even though logic told me that hoping was just another form of self-deception. More than that, I was terrified of what would come next. Our entire life was intertwined, financially, socially, emotionally. The thought of unraveling 12 years of shared history felt overwhelming and impossible. So instead of confronting Mark directly, I did what any emergency room nurse would do when faced with a complex case. I gathered more information. I began paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. And what I discovered painted an even more devastating picture of systematic deception. Mark's phone, which I'd never felt the need to monitor in 12 years of marriage, became a source of constant anxiety. I noticed how he'd flip it face down whenever he set it on surfaces, and how he'd carry it with him even when going to get a glass of water from the kitchen. During our Sunday afternoon couch time, when he used to leave it charging on the side table, he now kept it in his pocket, occasionally pulling it out to check messages with quick, furtive glances. I also began noticing changes in our financial patterns that I'd previously attributed to normal fluctuations. Mark had always handled our online banking, but I had access to the accounts and would occasionally check balances or review statements. Now, looking more carefully, I could see unusual charges that hadn't registered as significant before. Restaurant bills on Tuesday and Thursday evenings that were consistently for two people. Parking fees for areas of Phoenix I knew Mark had no business visiting. and purchases at stores that seemed odd for someone who was supposedly working late. The most damning evidence came when I decided to do something I'd never done in our entire marriage. I looked through his credit card statements with the specific intention of finding evidence of infidelity. What I found was a clear pattern of deception that went far beyond watching romantic movies together. Every Tuesday for the past 6 months, there were charges at Romano's, an upscale Italian restaurant in Scottsdale that Mark and I had never visited together. The bills were always between $80 and $120, clearly for 2 people dining together. On Thursdays, the pattern shifted to more casual venues, sometimes a wine bar in Tempe, sometimes a sushi restaurant in downtown Phoenix, once even a comedy club that I'd mentioned wanting to visit, but Mark had dismissed as not worth the drive. There were other charges that created a picture of a relationship that had progressed far beyond casual encounters. Flowers from an expensive Scottsdale florist, jewelry from a boutique I'd never heard of, and most painfully, a charge for a weekend at the Phoenician Resort in January when Mark had told me he was attending a work conference in San Diego. As I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot after my shift on Monday evening, reviewing months of financial records on my phone, I felt something shift inside me. The desperate hope that had been keeping me from confronting the truth finally crumbled under the weight of evidence. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a brief lapse in judgment. This was a sustained, deliberate affair that had been carefully hidden through months of lies and manipulation. But even more devastating than the betrayal itself was the realization of how systematically I'd been deceived. Mark hadn't just cheated on me, he'd convinced me to be complicit in my own deception. Every time he'd suggested I have dinner with friends on Tuesday or Thursday, every time he'd encouraged me to take extra shifts or attend training sessions, every time he'd praised me for being such an independent, understanding wife, he'd been manipulating me into giving him the freedom to betray our marriage. I drove home that Monday evening, knowing that I could no longer pretend ignorance. The confrontation I'd been dreading was inevitable, but I still had no idea how to approach it. Should I present the evidence calmly and demand an explanation? Should I hire a private investigator to gather even more proof? Should I consult a divorce lawyer before saying anything to Mark? The internal debate was exhausting, made worse by the fact that I had no one to talk to about what I'd discovered. Jennifer would have been the obvious choice for support, but I felt too humiliated to admit that I'd been so thoroughly deceived. My parents would be devastated, and I wasn't ready to deal with their emotional reactions when I was barely managing my own. Mark's friends were our mutual friends, and I couldn't trust them to keep the conversation confidential. So I found myself completely alone with the most devastating knowledge of my life, trying to figure out how to handle a situation I'd never imagined I'd face. Tuesday evening became a test of my ability to maintain normalcy while being eaten alive by anxiety and rage. Mark followed his usual script perfectly, suggesting around 5 p.m. that I grab dinner with Jennifer since I'd had a tough day. He was so casual, so caring in his delivery that I almost admired the skill with which he'd learned to lie. "That sounds nice," I heard myself saying, playing along with the charade, even though every word felt like poison in my mouth. "I'll text her and see if she's free." But instead of meeting Jennifer, I drove to a coffee shop in Scottsdale, not far from Romano's restaurant where Mark and his mystery woman had shared so many Tuesday evening dinners. I sat there for 3 hours, drinking terrible coffee and staring out the window, trying to summon the courage to drive to the restaurant and confront them directly, but I couldn't do it. The thought of seeing Mark with another woman, of witnessing the intimacy that should have been reserved for me, felt like it might actually kill me. So instead, I drove home at my usual time and walked into our house knowing that Mark had just finished spending an evening with someone else, knowing that he would greet me with the same loving smile he'd been perfecting for months. "How was dinner with Jennifer?" he asked, looking up from his laptop as I entered the living room. "Fine," I managed, my voice sounding strange and hollow even to my own ears. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Netflix was still open on our television screen, paused on an episode of Virgin River that showed exactly where Mark and his affair partner had left off before I'd come home. He'd been so comfortable, so confident in his deception, that he'd forgotten to close the application before I returned. "You left Netflix on," I said quietly, pointing to the screen. Mark's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, panic, calculation, before settling into what I now recognized as his practiced deception face. "Oh yeah," he said with a casual laugh that sounded forced. "I was taking a break from work and just had it on for background noise. You know how I can't focus in complete silence, but Virgin River wasn't background noise. It was a show that required attention to follow the plot, a show about small-town romance and relationship drama that Mark had never shown any interest in during our 12 years together. And the episode was paused at a crucial romantic scene, exactly the kind of moment that would require two people to pause for conversation or other activities. "Since when do you watch shows like this?" I asked, my voice carefully controlled. "Since never," he replied with another forced laugh. I was just scrolling through trying to find something else and accidentally clicked on it. You know how Netflix can be. You click on one thing and suddenly you're watching something completely different. The lie was so elaborate, so unnecessary, that it confirmed everything I'd been afraid to believe. Mark wasn't just cheating on me. He was lying with such ease and creativity that it was clearly a skill he'd been developing for months. How many other lies had I accepted without question? How many other times had he looked me in the eye and fed me carefully crafted deceptions while I smiled and trusted him completely? I stood there in our living room, looking at the man I'd loved for over a decade, and realized that I no longer knew who he was. The Mark I'd married would never have been capable of this level of deception. Either he had changed completely, or I had never really known him at all. "I'm going to bed," I said, unable to continue the conversation without screaming or crying, or both. "Already?" he asked, checking his phone for the time. "It's only 9:30. "I'm tired," I replied, which was true. I was exhausted from pretending, exhausted from analyzing every word and gesture, exhausted from living in a marriage that had become a performance for his benefit. I lay in bed that night listening to Mark finish his work in the office, hearing him move through his nighttime routine, feeling the mattress shift as he settled in beside me. He whispered, "Good night," and kissed my shoulder, just as he had thousands of times before. But now his touch felt like a violation. This man who was lying next to me, who was sharing our bed and our life, had been sharing himself with someone else for months while convincing me that I was imagining problems that didn't exist. The worst part was that I still loved him. Despite everything I'd discovered, despite the evidence of systematic betrayal, I still felt the same deep affection that had sustained our marriage for 12 years. I still found comfort in his presence, still felt attracted to him, still wanted to believe that somehow we could find our way back to the relationship we'd once had. But love without trust is like a house without a foundation. It might stand for a while, but eventually the entire structure collapses. And lying there in the dark next to my cheating husband, I realized that our marriage was already collapsing, even if Mark didn't know it yet. Wednesday and Thursday passed in a blur of emotional turmoil and desperate strategizing. I found myself Googling things like how to confront a cheating spouse and signs your marriage can survive infidelity while sitting in my car during breaks at the hospital. I read dozens of articles and forum posts from other people who'd discovered affairs, looking for guidance on how to handle a situation that felt impossibly complex and painful. Some sources recommended immediate confrontation, arguing that continuing to live with the knowledge without addressing it would only make things worse. Others suggested gathering more evidence before saying anything, warning that cheating spouses often deny everything and manipulate their partners into believing they're imagining things. Still others advised consulting with a therapist or lawyer before taking any action at all. But the most common theme I encountered was the importance of being prepared for any outcome. Most sources emphasize that confronting a cheating spouse is essentially forcing a crisis that will either lead to genuine reconciliation or the end of the marriage. There's rarely a middle ground where you can go back to the way things were before. That realization terrified me because I wasn't ready for either outcome. I wasn't ready to do the hard work of rebuilding trust and intimacy in a damaged marriage, but I also wasn't ready to face the practical and emotional devastation of divorce. I wanted a third option that would somehow restore our relationship without requiring me to go through the pain of confronting Mark's betrayal. But life rarely offers us the easy paths we desperately want. And Thursday evening would prove that sometimes the universe forces us to act even when we don't feel ready. Mark had followed his usual script, suggesting I grab dinner with friends after my shift. And I had agreed while knowing exactly what he planned to do with his free evening. But this time, instead of driving to a coffee shop to wait in anguish, I decided to take back some control of the situation. I called Jennifer and asked if she wanted to meet for dinner at Romano's in Scottsdale. "That's kind of fancy for a Thursday night," she said, surprised by the suggestion. "Are we celebrating something?" "I just feel like trying somewhere new," I replied, my heart pounding as I made the decision that would force the confrontation I'd been dreading. If Mark was going to use our shared evenings for his affair, then he was going to have to explain why his wife was sitting 3 tables away when he arrived with another woman. Jennifer and I arrived at Romano's at 7:15 p.m., just early enough to secure a table with a clear view of the entrance, but tucked away enough that I hoped Mark wouldn't immediately notice me. The restaurant was elegant in an understated way, with warm lighting and intimate seating arrangements that made it clear why Mark had chosen this place for his romantic encounters. Every detail seemed designed to facilitate connection and conversation, from the soft jazz playing in the background to the wine list that encouraged sharing bottles rather than ordering by the glass. "This is really nice," Jennifer commented as we settled into our booth. "How did you hear about this place?" "Online review," I lied, my eyes fixed on the door while I pretended to study the menu. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my heart beating so hard I was sure Jennifer would notice. But she was distracted by the atmosphere and the wine list, chatting casually about her latest dating adventures while I waited for my world to explode. At 7:43 p.m., Mark walked through the front door, and my breath caught in my throat. He looked handsome in a way that hurt to observe, wearing the navy blue button-down shirt I'd bought him for his birthday. His hair styled more carefully than usual, his face relaxed and happy in a way I hadn't seen in months. But it wasn't his appearance that devastated me. It was the way he held the door open and smiled at someone behind him, someone who was clearly the center of his attention and affection. She was nothing like what I'd expected, which somehow made everything worse. I'd imagined his affair partner as some young, obviously seductive woman who represented everything I wasn't. Instead, she appeared to be close to my age, with shoulder-length auburn hair and a warm, genuine smile. She was attractive, but not dramatically so, dressed professionally but not provocatively. She looked like someone I could have been friends with under different circumstances, which made Mark's betrayal feel even more personal and devastating. But what destroyed me completely was watching how Mark interacted with her. He touched her lower back as they walked to their table, the same gentle gesture he'd used to guide me through crowds for years. He pulled out her chair with the same attentiveness he'd once shown me. When she laughed at something he said, he leaned forward with the focused attention of someone completely captivated by his companion. This wasn't a casual fling or a meaningless physical affair. The body language, the comfort level, the obvious intimacy between them suggested a deep emotional connection that had been building for months. Mark wasn't just cheating on me. He was falling in love with someone else while maintaining the facade of our marriage. "Sarah, are you okay?" Jennifer's voice seemed to come from far away. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I turned to look at her, realizing that I'd been staring across the restaurant for several minutes without saying anything. My face must have reflected the devastation I was feeling because Jennifer immediately became concerned. "I'm fine," I managed, though we both knew it wasn't true. Just tired from work. But I wasn't fine. Watching Mark with another woman in a restaurant he'd never brought me to, seeing him be the attentive, romantic partner I'd been missing for months, realizing that our entire relationship had become a performance he maintained while building something real with someone else. It was more than I could process. I excused myself to go to the bathroom, hoping a few minutes alone would help me regain some composure. But as I walked past their table, I heard fragments of their conversation that made everything exponentially worse. Talked, To my lawyer today about the divorce timeline, Mark was saying in a voice so soft and intimate that I almost didn't recognize it as belonging to my husband, the woman whose name I still didn't know but who apparently knew more about my marriage than I did, reached across the table to take his hand. "I know it's complicated," she said gently, "but I really think you'll be happier once everything is finalized." I barely made it to the bathroom before my legs gave out. Sitting in a stall, trying to breathe through waves of nausea and panic, I realized that Mark's affair wasn't just a betrayal, it was part of an exit strategy. While I'd been working extra shifts and encouraging his career advancement, while I'd been planning our future and trusting his explanations for our growing distance, he'd been methodically planning the end of our marriage. The cruelest part was that he'd been discussing divorce with both his affair partner and apparently a lawyer while maintaining the illusion of our relationship with me. I'd been living in a marriage that had already ended, but only I hadn't been informed. When I returned to the table, Jennifer immediately noticed that something was seriously wrong. My face must have been pale, and I'm sure my hands were visibly shaking as I tried to drink water. "Sarah, you're scaring me," she said quietly. "What's going on?" I looked across the restaurant where Mark and his companion were sharing dessert, their heads close together in intimate conversation, completely oblivious to my presence. They looked like a couple celebrating an anniversary, comfortable and happy in a way that Mark and I hadn't been in months. "My husband is here," I whispered to Jennifer. "With another woman." Jennifer's eyes widened, and she immediately turned to scan the restaurant. "Where?" she asked, her voice filled with protective anger. "Don't look," I said urgently. "Table near the back, navy blue shirt." Jennifer managed a discreet glance and then turned back to me with an expression of shock and sympathy. "Oh, honey," she said softly. "How long have you known?" "I suspected for a few days," I replied, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, despite the chaos in my head. But I hoped I was wrong. We sat there for another 20 minutes, Jennifer holding my hand while I tried to figure out what to do next. The rational part of my mind knew I should march over to their table and confront them both. The devastated wife in me wanted to scream and throw things and make a scene that would humiliate Mark as much as he'd humiliated me. But the practical nurse in me recognized that I was in shock and not capable of making good decisions. "Do you want to leave?" Jennifer asked gently. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. We paid our bill and left the restaurant, walking past Mark's table where he was so absorbed in his companion that he never looked up. Even as his wife walked within 5 feet of him, he was completely focused on the woman who apparently represented his future, while I had become nothing more than an obstacle to overcome. Jennifer drove me home in my car while her husband picked her up, a kindness that I was too emotionally shattered to properly appreciate at the time. She sat with me in my living room, the same living room where Mark had been entertaining his affair partner twice a week for months, and helped me process what I'd witnessed. "What are you going to do?" she asked after I'd explained the Netflix discovery and everything I'd uncovered since then. "I don't know," I admitted. "I keep hoping there's some explanation that doesn't mean our marriage is over, but I heard him talking about divorce lawyers. I think he's already decided to leave me. He just hasn't figured out how to tell me yet." The next few hours were the darkest of my life. After Jennifer left, I sat alone in our house, surrounded by 12 years of shared memories and joint possessions, waiting for Mark to come home from his date. Every photo on our walls, every piece of furniture we'd chosen together, every small domestic detail that had once represented love and partnership now felt like evidence of my own stupidity. How had I been so blind? How had I failed to see that the man I'd trusted completely had been systematically dismantling our marriage while I worked extra shifts to support our financial goals? How had I convinced myself that our growing emotional distance was temporary when he was actually transferring his affection to someone else? Mark came home at 11:47 p.m., nearly 2 hours later than his usual return time from these supposed work sessions. I heard his key in the door, heard him move through the house quietly, assuming I was asleep. He paused outside our bedroom door, probably checking to see if I was awake, before continuing to the bathroom for his nighttime routine. When he finally came to bed, I pretended to be asleep, lying perfectly still while he settled next to me. But my mind was racing with questions I wasn't ready to ask and answers I wasn't prepared to hear. The man lying next to me had spent the evening planning our divorce with another woman while I sat 3 tables away, invisible and irrelevant to the future he was creating. The physical proximity felt unbearable. This person who had shared my bed for over a decade, who knew my body and my habits better than anyone else, who had held me through nightmares and celebrated my successes, had become a stranger whose presence made my skin crawl. Yet I still loved him, which made everything infinitely more painful. Friday morning brought a new level of surreal torture. Mark followed his usual routine, returning from his run with his characteristic good humor, kissing my forehead and asking about my plans for the day. The casual intimacy that had once comforted me now felt like a cruel performance, especially knowing that he'd shared similar moments with another woman less than 12 hours earlier. "I was thinking we could try that new sushi place tonight," he suggested over coffee, as if he hadn't spent the previous evening discussing divorce with his affair partner. "You've been working so hard lately, you deserve a nice dinner out." The irony was overwhelming. Mark was suggesting a romantic dinner with his wife the day after having a romantic dinner with his girlfriend, apparently seeing no contradiction in maintaining both relationships simultaneously. Either he had compartmentalized his life so completely that he could genuinely switch between his 2 relationships without conscious effort, or he was such a skilled manipulator that he could fake authentic affection while actively planning to abandon our marriage. "That sounds nice," I heard myself saying, continuing the charade because I still didn't know how to force the conversation that would end everything. But I couldn't maintain the pretense much longer. The combination of sleep deprivation, emotional trauma, and the stress of pretending normalcy was taking a physical toll. I found myself making mistakes at work, forgetting patient instructions, and missing obvious symptoms that should have been easy to catch. My colleagues were starting to notice, and I knew that my professional performance was suffering because my personal life was falling apart. During my lunch break on Friday, I did something I'd never imagined I would do. I called a divorce attorney. Not because I decided to end my marriage, but because I needed to understand what my options were when Mark finally found the courage to tell me what I already knew. The consultation was brief but devastating. The lawyer explained that Arizona is a community property state, which meant that our house, our savings, and our debts would be divided equally, regardless of who was at fault for the marriage's failure. She also warned me that if Mark had been planning the divorce for months, he might have already taken steps to protect certain assets or gather evidence to support his position. "Has there been any unusual activity in your joint accounts?" she asked. "Large withdrawals, transfers to separate accounts, that kind of thing?" I realized that I hadn't been monitoring our finances closely enough to answer that question. Mark had always handled the day-to-day banking, and I'd trusted him to manage our money responsibly. But if he'd been planning to leave, he might have been strategically positioning our assets to his advantage while I remained oblivious. The lawyer also asked about potential grounds for divorce, and I found myself describing Mark's affair in clinical terms that somehow made it feel even more real and devastating. Hearing myself explain the Netflix discovery, the restaurant charges, and the conversation I'd overheard about divorce lawyers made the situation feel final in a way that my own internal processing hadn't achieved. "Do you want to try to save the marriage?" the lawyer asked gently. "Because if you do, you might want to consider couples counseling before taking any legal action. But if your husband is already consulting with attorneys, you need to protect yourself by understanding your rights and options." That question haunted me for the rest of the day. Did I want to save my marriage? Could I ever trust Mark again after months of systematic deception? Was it possible to rebuild a relationship with someone who had been planning to abandon it while pretending everything was fine? The logical answer was that our marriage was already over. Mark had made that decision months ago when he started his affair and began discussing divorce with his girlfriend. I was just the last person to be informed about the end of my own relationship. But the emotional answer was more complicated. Despite everything I'd discovered, I still loved the man I'd married. I still missed the connection we'd once shared. I still wanted to believe that the Mark who had been my partner for 12 years was the real person, and that the Mark who was cheating and lying was an aberration that could somehow be corrected. That internal conflict was eating me alive. I felt like I was drowning in uncertainty, unable to move forward, but also unable to go back to the comfortable ignorance I'd maintained for months. Every moment felt like a choice between confronting the truth and continuing to live a lie. But neither option seemed bearable. Friday evening's dinner at the sushi restaurant was a masterclass in cognitive dissonance. Mark was attentive and charming, asking about my day and sharing funny stories from his work. He complimented my appearance, held my hand across the table, and behaved like the loving husband I'd fallen in love with years earlier. If I hadn't known about his affair, I would have considered it a perfect evening that reminded me why I'd married him. But I did know about his affair. I knew that he'd shared similar intimate dinners with another woman twice a week for months. I knew that he'd been discussing divorce with both his lawyer and his girlfriend while planning romantic evenings with his wife. The contrast between his performance and his reality was so jarring that I felt like I was losing my grip on what was real and what was manipulation. "You seem distracted," Mark observed as we shared a bottle of sake. "Everything okay at work?" The question was asked with such apparent concern that I almost confessed everything right there. Part of me wanted to end the torture of pretending, to force the conversation that would at least give me clarity about where I stood. But another part of me recognized that having this confrontation in a public restaurant would be humiliating for both of us and potentially damage any possibility of salvaging our relationship. "Just tired?" I replied, the same excuse I'd been using for days. "It's been a busy week." Mark nodded sympathetically and suggested we go home early so I could rest. Another gesture that would have seemed thoughtful if I hadn't known it was performed by someone who was actively betraying me. The gap between his words and his actions had become so wide that I felt like I was living in an alternate reality where nothing meant what it appeared to mean. That night, lying in bed next to Mark while he slept peacefully, I realized that I had reached the absolute lowest point of my life. I was living with someone who was systematically destroying our marriage while maintaining a facade of love and commitment. I was pretending to be happy while dying inside. I was working to support our shared financial goals while he planned to divide our assets in a divorce I didn't know was coming. Most devastating of all, I was still hoping for a miracle that would somehow restore our relationship without requiring me to confront the painful truth that our marriage was already over. I was clinging to a fantasy of reconciliation while the reality of abandonment grew more obvious each day. But sometimes we have to reach the absolute bottom before we find the strength to climb back up. And lying there in the darkness next to my cheating husband, surrounded by the wreckage of everything I'd believed about my life, I realized that continuing to live in this limbo was destroying me more thoroughly than any confrontation could. The next morning would bring the moment when I finally found the courage to stop being a victim of Mark's deception and start taking control of my own future. But it would also bring revelations that would make everything I'd already discovered seem simple by comparison and force me to find strength I didn't know I possessed. Saturday morning arrived with Arizona's typical desert sunshine streaming through our bedroom windows, but I woke up feeling like I'd been trapped underground for weeks. Mark was already gone for his run, as usual, but this time I didn't lay in bed waiting for him to return. Instead, I got up, made coffee, and sat at our kitchen table with a legal pad and pen, finally ready to stop being passive in my own life story. I wrote down everything I knew: the Netflix viewing history, the restaurant charges, the conversation I'd overheard about divorce lawyers, the timeline of Mark's behavior changes. Seeing it all laid out in black and white made the pattern undeniable and helped me organize my thoughts in a way that emotional processing hadn't achieved. For the first time in days, I felt like I was thinking clearly instead of just reacting to one devastating revelation after another. When Mark returned from his run, I was still sitting at the table with my notes. He noticed the legal pad immediately, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not quite fear, but definitely wariness. "Making lists?" he asked with forced casualness, pouring himself coffee while trying to read what I'd written. "We need to talk," I said quietly. my voice steadier than I'd expected. "About your affair." The coffee mug slipped from Mark's hand, hitting the granite countertop and shattering into pieces that scattered across the kitchen floor. For a moment, we both stared at the broken ceramic, and I realized it was a perfect metaphor for what was happening to our marriage. Mark's face went through a series of expressions: shock, panic, calculation, and finally resignation. He didn't try to deny it or demand to know what I was talking about. Instead, he sank into the chair across from me and put his head in his hands. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "Since Tuesday," I replied. "But I suspect it's been going on much longer than that." Mark looked up at me, and for the first time in months, I saw something genuine in his expression instead of the careful performance he'd been maintaining. It was pain, but also relief, as if the burden of deception had been weighing on him as heavily as the burden of betrayal had been weighing on me. 8 months, he said simply. "It started 8 months ago." The confirmation hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd already known the timeline. Hearing him admit to 8 months of systematic deception made it impossible to maintain any hope that this had been a brief lapse in judgment or a recent development that could be easily corrected. "Who is she?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "Her name is Rebecca," Mark said, still not meeting my eyes. "She's a project manager at a company we work with. We met during a client presentation last fall, Rebecca." Now the other woman had a name, which somehow made her more real and more threatening. But it also made Mark's betrayal more specific and concrete, which helped me focus my anger on the actual situation instead of imagining worst-case scenarios. "Are you in love with her?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer from watching them together at the restaurant. Mark was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands while I waited for him to destroy what was left of our marriage with his honesty. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes," he said, "I am." Those 3 words accomplished what months of suspicion and evidence gathering had not. They gave me complete clarity about the state of our marriage. Mark hadn't just cheated on me physically, he had transferred his emotional loyalty to another woman while maintaining the facade of our relationship for reasons I didn't yet understand. "Then why are you still here?" I asked, genuinely curious about his motivations. "Why haven't you asked for a divorce?" Mark finally looked up at me, and I saw tears in his eyes for the first time since we'd started this conversation. "Because I didn't want to hurt you," he said, "and because I was a coward. I kept thinking maybe I could end things with Rebecca and fix our marriage, but every time I tried, I realized I didn't want to. And I kept putting off telling you because I knew it would destroy you, and I couldn't figure out how to do it without completely ruining your life." The irony was staggering. Mark had been lying to me for 8 months in order to protect me from being hurt, apparently not realizing that the lies themselves were more devastating than the truth would have been. He'd been making decisions about my life and my future without consulting me, treating me like a child who couldn't handle adult realities. "So you've been planning to leave me while pretending to love me?" I said, my anger finally starting to surface. "You've been using our home to entertain your girlfriend while encouraging me to work extra shifts so you'd have more time with her. You've been discussing divorce with lawyers while planning romantic dinners with your wife. Do you have any idea how cruel that is?" Mark's face crumpled and he started crying in earnest. "I know," he said through his tears. "I know how terrible it sounds. But I was trapped. I couldn't figure out how to end our marriage without destroying you, and I couldn't figure out how to end things with Rebecca because I love her. So I just kept postponing the decision and hoping something would change." Watching Mark cry should have triggered my sympathy and protective instincts. For 12 years, his pain had been my pain, and his struggles had automatically become my priority. But something fundamental had shifted inside me during this conversation. Instead of wanting to comfort him, I felt a cold fury that surprised me with its intensity. "You were trapped?" I repeated, my voice rising for the first time. "You created this situation by starting an affair, and then you decided the solution was to lie to everyone involved rather than take responsibility for your choices. You've been making me complicit in my own betrayal, while positioning yourself as the victim of circumstances you created." Mark looked genuinely surprised by my anger, which told me something important about how he'd been viewing our situation. He'd apparently convinced himself that he was the one suffering, caught between two women he cared about, forced into deception by impossible circumstances. It hadn't occurred to him that I might be furious rather than devastated, or that I might see his behavior as selfish rather than simply unfortunate. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said defensively. "I didn't plan to fall in love with Rebecca. It just happened, and once it did, I didn't know how to handle it." "But you did know how to handle it," I replied coldly. "You handled it by lying to both of us for 8 months while you figured out how to arrange your life for maximum convenience. You handled it by using our joint credit cards to pay for dates with your girlfriend while telling me we needed to be more careful with spending. You handled it by encouraging me to work extra shifts so you'd have more time to build a relationship with someone else." As I spoke, I realized that my anger was actually empowering rather than destructive. For months, I'd been questioning my own perceptions and making excuses for Mark's behavior because I trusted him more than I trusted myself. But now that I knew the truth, I could see clearly how manipulative and self-serving his actions had been. "What do you want to do now?" Mark asked quietly. It was a reasonable question, but it revealed another layer of his selfishness. Even in this moment of confession, he was expecting me to take responsibility for solving the problem he'd created. He wanted me to decide whether we should try counseling or get divorced, whether he should end his affair or leave our marriage, whether we should fight for our relationship or accept that it was over. But for the first time in months, I didn't feel obligated to make Mark's life easier or to protect him from the consequences of his choices. "I don't know what I want to do," I said honestly. "But I know what you're going to do. You're going to end your relationship with Rebecca today, and you're going to tell her that you need to focus on saving your marriage. Or you're going to pack your things and move out today, and we're going to start divorce proceedings on Monday. But you're not going to continue having both relationships while I pretend not to know what's happening." Mark stared at me in shock. I could see him processing this ultimatum, probably trying to find a way to negotiate or buy more time to figure out how to handle the situation with minimal disruption to his life. "You can't ask me to choose right now," he said finally. "This is too important a decision to make in the heat of the moment. We should take some time to think about this rationally." "You've had 8 months to think about it rationally," I replied. "You've been making choices about our marriage and my future for 8 months without consulting me. Now it's my turn to set the terms." Something in my tone must have convinced Mark that I was serious, because his entire demeanor changed. The tears stopped, and I could see him shifting into problem-solving mode, trying to figure out how to manage this crisis in a way that would minimize his losses. "If I end things with Rebecca," he said carefully, "how do I know you'll be able to forgive me? How do I know we can actually rebuild our marriage instead of just postponing the inevitable divorce?" It was a fair question, but it also revealed how completely Mark had misunderstood our situation. He was treating this like a business negotiation where he needed guarantees before making concessions, apparently not realizing that his 8 months of deception had eliminated any possibility of certainty about our future. "You don't get guarantees," I said firmly. "You betrayed my trust and lied to me for 8 months. If you want to save our marriage, you'll have to do it without knowing whether your effort will succeed. That's the risk you take when you destroy the foundation of a relationship and then decide you want to rebuild it." Mark was quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling with the idea that he couldn't control the outcome of this situation. Finally, he pulled out his phone and started typing a message. "I'm texting Rebecca to tell her I can't see her anymore," he said, showing me the screen. "I'm telling her that I need to focus on my marriage and that our relationship has to end immediately." I read the message, which was brief and final, but also surprisingly kind. Mark wasn't throwing Rebecca under the bus or blaming her for their affair. He was taking responsibility for his decision to end their relationship, which suggested that he might be capable of the kind of mature behavior that rebuilding our marriage would require. "Send it," I said, and watched as Mark pressed the button that officially ended his affair. What happened next surprised both of us. Instead of feeling relief or satisfaction, I felt a profound sadness that had nothing to do with anger or betrayal. Watching Mark end his relationship with Rebecca made me realize that our marriage had been competing with another relationship for months. And forcing him to choose me didn't necessarily mean that I had won anything meaningful. Now what? Mark asked, putting his phone face down on the table. Now we see if it's possible to rebuild a marriage that's been built on lies for 8 months, I said. But we're going to do it honestly, which means you're going to tell me everything I ask about your affair, and I'm going to tell you exactly how your betrayal has affected me. And we're going to do it with professional help because I don't trust either of us to navigate this alone. Mark nodded, but I could see reservation in his expression. He'd agreed to end his affair and try to save our marriage, but I could tell he was already wondering whether he'd made the right choice. The fact that he was having second thoughts, even after making the decision, told me that our work was just beginning. But something fundamental had changed during this conversation. For the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my own life. I'd forced Mark to choose between his affair and our marriage, and regardless of what happened next, I would never again be the passive victim of someone else's deception. The real test would come in the following weeks and months, when we'd have to figure out whether two people who had hurt each other so deeply could find their way back to love and trust. But for now, it was enough that I'd found my voice and used it to demand honesty instead of accepting comfortable lies. The 3 months that followed our kitchen table confrontation were unlike anything either Mark or I had ever experienced. Marriage counseling with Dr. Patricia Stevens became the cornerstone of our week, every Thursday at 4 p.m., where we spent 50 minutes dissecting the ruins of our relationship under the guidance of someone trained to help couples navigate betrayal and reconstruction. The first session was brutal. Dr. Stevens, a woman in her early 60s with kind eyes and an unflinching approach to difficult truths, asked Mark to describe his affair in detail while I sat 3 feet away listening to confirmation of my worst fears. He had met Rebecca at a client meeting in July, had been attracted to her immediately, and had spent months building an emotional connection before their relationship became physical in October. The first time we kissed, Mark said, his voice barely audible, I knew I should end it immediately. But I also knew I didn't want to. Dr. Stevens turned to me. How does it feel to hear Mark describe his relationship with Rebecca? Like he's talking about someone else's life, I replied honestly. The man sitting next to me doesn't seem like someone who would be capable of sustaining an 8-month deception. But the evidence is overwhelming, so I have to accept that either he's completely different than I thought, or I never really knew him at all. That became one of the central themes of our counseling, the question of whether Mark's affair represented a fundamental character flaw that had always existed, or whether it was an aberration that could be corrected. Dr. Stevens explained that most affairs aren't about sex or even romantic love. They're about unmet emotional needs and the gradual erosion of intimacy in the primary relationship. Mark, she said during our 3rd session, can you identify what was missing in your marriage that made you vulnerable to an affair? Mark thought for a long time before answering. I felt like Sarah and I had become roommates instead of lovers, he said finally. We were efficient at managing our household and our careers, but we'd stopped being curious about each other. When I met Rebecca, she was fascinated by my thoughts and opinions in a way that Sarah hadn't been in years. Hearing this was devastating because it contained enough truth to be painful. Mark and I had fallen into comfortable patterns that prioritized productivity over connection. We'd stopped asking each other meaningful questions or sharing our deeper thoughts and feelings. We'd maintained the structure of marriage while allowing the emotional intimacy to atrophy. But Dr. Stevens helped me understand that Mark's unmet needs didn't justify his choices. Feeling disconnected from your spouse is a problem that can be addressed directly, she explained. Having an affair is a solution that creates more problems while avoiding the real work of rebuilding intimacy. The hardest part of counseling was learning to differentiate between Mark's legitimate complaints about our marriage and his attempts to justify his betrayal. Yes, we had grown apart emotionally. Yes, our physical intimacy had declined. Yes, we had both been taking our relationship for granted. But none of those problems required deception as a solution. Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own process of recovery and self-discovery. Dr. Stevens recommended individual therapy in addition to our couples sessions, and I began seeing Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a therapist who specialized in helping people rebuild self-esteem after betrayal. "Your anger is healthy," Dr. Rodriguez told me during one of our early sessions. "But underneath that anger, what else are you feeling?" "Stupid," I admitted. "I feel incredibly stupid for not seeing what was happening. I pride myself on being observant and intuitive, especially in my work as a nurse. But I completely missed the fact that my husband was living a double life." Dr. Rodriguez helped me understand that Mark's deception had been deliberate and skillful, designed specifically to avoid detection. "Intelligent, observant people get deceived all the time," he explained, "because they're being lied to by someone they trust. Your failure to detect his affair isn't evidence that you're stupid. It's evidence that you trusted your husband to be honest with you." But beyond the issue of self-blame, I was struggling with a more fundamental question. Did I actually want to save my marriage? Or was I just afraid of the alternative? Dr. Rodriguez helped me explore this question without judgment, encouraging me to consider what I really wanted rather than what I thought I should want. If Mark had never had an affair, he asked during one session, would you have been satisfied with your marriage for the rest of your life? The answer was complicated. Mark and I had been content but not passionate, comfortable but not deeply connected. We'd built a functional partnership that worked well for managing daily life, but didn't provide much emotional or intellectual stimulation. The affair had certainly destroyed the foundation of trust, but it had also exposed problems that existed long before Rebecca entered the picture. This realization led to one of the most important insights of my recovery. I didn't just want to save my marriage, I wanted to transform it into something better than it had been before. But that would require both Mark and me to become different people than we'd been during our first 12 years together. The practical work of rebuilding trust was even more challenging than the emotional processing. Dr. Stevens introduced us to a concept called radical transparency, which meant that Mark had to account for his time and activities in ways that felt invasive but necessary. For 3 months, he shared his phone passwords, his location data, his credit card statements, and his daily schedule with me. He called or texted whenever his plans changed, no matter how minor the adjustment. At first, this level of monitoring felt like punishment for both of us. Mark resented being treated like a criminal, and I hated being cast in the role of a suspicious warden. But gradually, the transparency began to rebuild my confidence in Mark's commitment to our marriage. More importantly, it forced him to recognize how his choices affected my sense of security and well-being. I never realized how much mental energy it takes to wonder where your spouse is and what they're doing, Mark said during one of our counseling sessions. Now that I have to account for my time, I understand how exhausting it must have been for you to live with constant uncertainty. The physical aspect of our relationship required its own careful attention. Dr. Stevens explained that sexual intimacy after betrayal often involves grief for what was lost combined with hope for what might be rebuilt. She recommended that we approach physical reconnection slowly and with explicit communication about boundaries and comfort levels. The first time Mark and I made love after discovering his affair was 6 weeks after our kitchen table confrontation. It was awkward and emotional, interrupted by my tears and his apologies. But it was also a tentative step toward reclaiming something that had belonged to us before Rebecca became part of Mark's life. We were both different people than we'd been before the affair, and our physical relationship had to evolve to accommodate those changes. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in how we communicated with each other. The crisis had forced us to develop skills we'd never needed during our comfortable years. We learned to ask for what we needed instead of hoping the other person would guess. We learned to express disappointment and frustration without attacking each other's character. We learned to share our fears and insecurities instead of protecting each other from difficult emotions. I was afraid that if I told you how lonely I felt in our marriage, you'd think it meant I didn't love you, Mark explained during one particularly breakthrough session. So I just accepted the loneliness and tried to find ways to cope with it. But when I met Rebecca, suddenly I wasn't lonely anymore, and I didn't want to give that up. And I was afraid that if I told you how rejected I felt when you stopped initiating physical intimacy, you'd think I was being needy or demanding, I replied. So I convinced myself that it was normal for passion to fade in long marriages, even though I was actually grieving the loss of that connection. Dr. Stevens helped us understand that we'd both been protecting each other from truths that might have prevented the affair if we'd been brave enough to share them earlier. The irony was that our attempts to avoid hurting each other had created the emotional distance that made betrayal possible. 3 months after our confrontation, Mark and I went out to dinner at a restaurant we'd never been to before, a deliberate choice to create new memories instead of revisiting places loaded with history. As we sat across from each other, I realized that we were having the kind of conversation we should have been having for years. Honest, curious, emotionally intimate. "Do you think we're going to make it?" Mark asked as we shared dessert. "I think we're going to make something," I replied. "Whether it's a marriage or a conscious uncoupling or something else entirely, we're going to create it intentionally instead of just letting it happen to us." Mark reached across the table to take my hand, a gesture that had once been automatic but now felt deliberate and meaningful. "I'm sorry it took an affair for us to learn how to talk to each other," he said. "I'm sorry too," I replied. "But I'm also grateful that we're finally doing the work we should have been doing all along." That conversation marked a turning point in our recovery. We weren't just trying to return to our pre-affair relationship. We were building something entirely new based on the painful lessons we'd learned about communication, trust, and emotional intimacy. 6 months after Mark ended his affair, we renewed our wedding vows in a small ceremony in our backyard, attended only by our immediate families and closest friends. It wasn't a celebration of our original marriage, which had been built on assumptions and unspoken expectations. It was a commitment to the relationship we'd chosen to create together after learning the hard way that love, without honesty, is just a comfortable illusion. The vows you made 12 years ago were based on who you hoped to become together. Dr. Stevens observed during one of our final counseling sessions, "The vows you made yesterday are based on who you actually are and what you've learned about yourselves and each other. But if you've been following this story, hoping for a fairy tale, ending where betrayal leads to happily ever after, I need to tell you that recovery from infidelity is much more complex than that." Mark and I did save our marriage, but we both became different people in the process. The trust we rebuilt was stronger but more complicated than our original naive faith in each other. The love we rediscovered was deeper but also more realistic about human frailty and the work required to maintain connection over time. Most importantly, I learned that my strength and resilience were far greater than I'd ever imagined. The woman who discovered her husband's affair through Netflix viewing history was passive and afraid of confrontation. The woman who emerged from 6 months of counseling and hard emotional work was capable of demanding honesty, setting boundaries, and creating the kind of relationship she actually wanted rather than simply accepting what was offered. 2 years have passed since that March night when I discovered Mark's affair through our shared Netflix account, and I want to share with you the most important lessons I learned from what was undoubtedly the most challenging period of my life. Because while every betrayal is unique, the path to recovery and transformation follows patterns that can help anyone who finds themselves facing the devastating realization that their relationship isn't what they thought it was. The first and most crucial lesson is that discovering betrayal, while devastating, can also be a gift. I know that sounds impossible when you're in the middle of the pain, but bear with me. For months before I found evidence of Mark's affair, I'd been living with a vague sense that something was wrong in our marriage. I felt disconnected from my husband, sexually rejected, and emotionally lonely, but I kept telling myself these feelings were normal for a long-term relationship. I was accepting a diminished version of love because I was afraid that demanding more might mean losing everything. The affair forced me to stop accepting crumbs and start demanding the full meal. It shattered my comfortable illusions and forced me to confront the fact that our marriage had problems that needed to be addressed directly rather than endured quietly. Without that wake-up call, Mark and I might have continued our slow drift toward emotional divorce, never addressing the underlying issues that had made our relationship vulnerable to betrayal. The second lesson is that your initial response to betrayal will determine whether you become a victim or a catalyst for positive change. When I first discovered Mark's affair, my instinct was to hide from the truth, to hope it would go away, to continue pretending everything was fine while I died inside. That response would have guaranteed that I remained powerless while Mark continued to control the situation, but when I finally found the courage to confront Mark directly and demand that he choose between his affair and our marriage, I took back control of my own life. I stopped being something that happened to me and started being something I could influence. That shift from passive victim to active participant in my own story was the foundation for everything positive that followed. The third lesson is that rebuilding trust after betrayal requires both people to become better versions of themselves, not just return to who they were before. Mark couldn't just end his affair and expect our marriage to go back to normal. He had to examine why he'd been vulnerable to an affair in the first place, develop better communication skills, and learn to address problems directly rather than seeking escape routes. But I also had to change. I had to learn to express my needs clearly instead of hoping Mark would intuit them. I had to develop the courage to have difficult conversations instead of avoiding conflict to preserve peace. I had to stop being the accommodating wife who never wanted to be demanding and start being an equal partner who expected honesty and effort from our relationship. The fourth lesson is that forgiveness is not a destination, but a daily practice. People often ask me if I've forgiven Mark for his affair, as if forgiveness is something that happens once and then solves everything permanently. The truth is that I forgive Mark every day for different aspects of his betrayal as they surface in my memory or emotions. Some days forgiveness feels natural and healing. Other days it feels impossible, and I have to choose it anyway. Because the alternative is allowing bitterness to poison the relationship we're trying to rebuild. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or pretending the affair didn't happen. It means choosing not to use Mark's past mistakes as weapons in present disagreements. It means accepting that he's human and flawed while still holding him accountable for doing better going forward. It means releasing my right to punish him indefinitely in exchange for his commitment to earning back my trust through consistent actions over time. The fifth lesson is that professional help isn't a sign of failure. It's a tool that can save your relationship and your sanity. Mark and I probably could have muddled through our crisis alone, but we would have made many more mistakes and taken much longer to find our way back to each other. Dr. Stevens gave us frameworks for understanding betrayal and recovery that prevented us from getting stuck in cycles of blame and defensiveness. Individual therapy was equally important because it helped me process my own emotions without making Mark responsible for managing my healing. I learned that I couldn't rebuild my marriage until I rebuilt my sense of self-worth and personal agency. The woman who emerged from therapy was stronger, clearer about her needs, and more capable of being a true partner rather than a passive participant in her own relationship. The sixth lesson is that shared pain can become shared wisdom if you're willing to do the work together. Mark and I went through hell during those months of rebuilding, but we went through it together. Every difficult conversation, every therapy session, every moment of choosing connection over self-protection became part of a new foundation for our relationship. We learned that we could survive conflict and emerge stronger. We learned that we could be honest about our deepest fears and most shameful failures without losing each other's love. We learned that marriage isn't a safe haven from life's challenges. It's a partnership that gives you strength to face those challenges together. Today, Mark and I have a marriage that's better than anything we had during our first 12 years together. We communicate more honestly, love more intentionally, and appreciate each other more deeply because we know how close we came to losing everything. We still face challenges and disagreements, but we handle them with skills we never had before and wisdom earned through surviving the worst crisis of our lives. But I want to be clear about something important. Not every marriage should be saved after an affair. Some betrayals reveal fundamental incompatibilities or character flaws that make rebuilding impossible. Some people aren't willing to do the hard work that recovery requires. Some affairs are symptoms of problems so deep that divorce is actually the healthiest option for everyone involved. The difference is in how you respond to the crisis. If you discover betrayal in your relationship, you have choices about how to handle it. You can remain a victim of someone else's poor decisions, or you can become the author of your own story going forward. You can accept crumbs of affection and lies about commitment, or you can demand the full truth and real change. You can let fear of being alone trap you in a relationship that doesn't serve you, or you can find the courage to insist on something better, whether that's rebuilding with your current partner or starting over with someone new. The most important thing I can tell you is that you are stronger than you think you are. Whatever crisis you're facing in your relationship, whatever betrayal or disappointment or fear is threatening to overwhelm you, you have resources within yourself that you haven't discovered yet. The woman who sat in her living room staring at Netflix viewing history that revealed her husband's affair felt powerless and broken. The woman I am today knows that she can handle whatever life throws at her because she's already survived what felt like the worst thing that could possibly happen. If your relationship is struggling, don't wait for a crisis to force you into addressing the problems. Start having honest conversations now about what you need, what you're not getting, and what you're willing to change. If you're living with betrayal or deception, know that you deserve better, and that demanding better isn't selfish or unrealistic. It's essential for your well-being and the health of your relationship. And if you're the person who's been unfaithful or dishonest in your relationship, understand that your partner's pain is real and deserved. But that redemption is possible if you're willing to do the hard work of becoming someone worthy of trust again. The choice between easy lies and difficult truths will determine whether your relationship becomes stronger or whether it ends. But either outcome is better than living in the destructive limbo of ongoing deception. 2 years later, when Mark and I watch Netflix together on our Thursday evening dates, yes, we still have Thursday evenings together, but now they're intentional and honest. I sometimes think about how a simple shared account revealed the lies that were destroying our marriage. Technology that was designed to entertain us accidentally saved our relationship by forcing us to confront truths we'd been avoiding. But the real hero of this story isn't Netflix or couples, counseling, or even Mark's decision to end his affair. The real hero is the choice that both of us made to fight for something better instead of accepting something broken. Every day, in small ways and big ones, we choose to build the marriage we want instead of just enduring the one we have. That choice is available to everyone. Whether you're dealing with infidelity, communication problems, growing apart, or any of the thousands of challenges that can threaten a relationship, you can choose to be passive and hope things improve on their own. Or you can choose to be active and create the change you want to see. The choice you make will determine whether your relationship becomes a source of strength and joy in your life, or just another burden you carry. And that choice is always yours to make, no matter how powerless you might feel in this moment. Before I end this story, I want to ask you something important. Have you ever felt like you were living a lie in your relationship? Have you ever suspected that your partner wasn't being completely honest with you? Have you ever found yourself accepting less than you deserve because you were afraid of demanding more? If any of those questions resonated with you, I want you to know that you're not alone and that change is possible. But it starts with you finding the courage to stop accepting what isn't working and start insisting on what you need. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts about this story. Have you ever faced betrayal in a relationship? How did you handle it? What advice would you give to someone who's going through what I went through? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own strength and courage. And if this story helped you in any way, please consider subscribing to this channel and hitting the notification bell. Stories like these remind us that we're all more resilient than we think, and that our most devastating moments can become the foundation for our greatest transformations. Until next time, remember that you have the power to write your own story, no matter what chapter you're currently living.